Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and this morning we're visiting with John E. Johnson, author of the new book, Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. John Johnson, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to you. John is a Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon, a writer and a teaching pastor. He served in various churches, including Trinity International Church in The Hague, Netherlands. He's published articles in Bibliotheca Sacra and Trinity Journal. And to learn more about him, you can visit his blog at drjohnejohnson.com or .org. Dr. Johnson, this is quite an extraordinary undertaking to bring new insight into a gospel which is quite often quoted, of course, most notably John 3:16, which is of preeminence in the foundation of our faith. What was it in your years of study, of teaching, of experience that it really drove you to dig deeper into this particular gospel?
Well, the ironic thing is that I actually avoided this gospel for many years in my preaching. I've always found John to be somewhat mysterious in relation to the other Gospels. Someone once said that the other Gospels are bottom up and John is top down, just even with the way it begins. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago I began to see the book as a series of conversations. And then John suddenly became alive for me.
Understood. I come from a Jewish background. I was raised in the synagogue. I came to faith in my mid-40s. And the Gospel of John, as a matter of fact, all the Gospels were actually written to particular audiences with a particular theme. Matthew being the Gospel to the Jews with all the Old Testament references. And each one of the Gospels had a central point to it. One, that he was the Son of God. Two, that he was the Lamb of God. And we go through the various foundational platforms of the Gospels so that when we harmonize them, and I kind of think it's a misnomer that there are four Gospels. There's one Gospel told from 4 points of view, 4 perspectives based on experience, in the case of John, who was with Jesus, which makes it different than Mark, makes it different than Luke, but carries with it certain similarities to Matthew in the fact that they are experiential, contemporary, and conversational to establish not only the message of the Messiah, but his approach, how he encountered, who he went to, why he went to them, and establishing really the foundation today for understanding of this command that we have, which is to go out. We've become church goers, but are we really fulfilling what he did in his pattern, which was go out to the people? And we see a lot of that in the Gospel of John. Let's go back to your early upbringing and your first real encounter that said to John Johnson, you're going to serve the Lord in a dual capacity for the remainder of your life. And in that dual capacity as a professor, theologian, and pastorally as a preacher. Now, when we look at the inventory of gifts, it is uncommon, and I think you will agree, that preaching and teaching are not often found in the same person as far as primary gifting is concerned. You'll find that some are called to preach, and then there are those that are called to teach, but that combination, and actually in my own experience, my three equal giftings were preaching, teaching, and administration, which is an incredibly odd combination. However, I planted a congregation. I built it by preaching on Fridays and Saturdays and teaching on Tuesday mornings and Tuesday nights. And so it wound up that God, of course, knew exactly what he was doing. But my calling didn't come until I had already completed a 35-year career in corporate America. When did your calling come? When did you first get exposed to really knowing your purpose and how that path was going to lay out for you?
Sure. Well, I remember I was getting ready to go to the Air Force Academy. I had prepared at military school. I thought that would be my career. But just before I went to military school to prepare one more year, a man who had influenced my life actually led me to Jesus, stopped by where I was working one day and said, you ought to go into the ministry. And when he left and I went on to military school, I could not get that conversation out of my mind. So when I returned home, the night before I was to go to the academy, actually about 3 a.m, I changed my mind and I went into the ministry. Now, when I went into the ministry working with youth in San Diego, I ended up going to seminary at the advice of my pastor. But when I went, I told everyone I will never be a pastor. That had absolutely no interest to me at all. I wanted to just get grounded in the Word of God. But by the time I completed seminary, there was nothing I wanted more than to be a pastor. However, I also wanted to be a teacher because I believe it's one of my core gifts. So after an associate pastoral role for about 3 years, I went to seminary to finish my PhD so I could teach. But then I discovered that just teaching alone was not going to fulfill me. I needed to be out with people in their lives where I find great fulfillment. So for the last 16 years of my life, I've had a wonderful experience of being a lead pastor and then an associate professor at seminary. And actually, it couldn't be a better compliment. I'm sort of in the real world, if I could put it that way, and then I'm in the classroom. And it's how God's used me, I believe.
Well, it's a fascinating turn of events that you thought you were going to be an Air Force officer, and
yes,
someone spoke into your life. It speaks volumes to how important our words are prophetically, how important our words are from a impact perspective when somebody is truly operating in the gifts that God has given us. When truth is spoken and our hearts and our ears are prepared to receive it, we find ourselves to be willing vessels to change and exchange our agenda for God's agenda. And that's really in your formational years, and you're what, at this age, you're what, 18, 19 years old?
Yes, and in fact, I think one thing that was really interesting when I was so confused at that time, I called the Air Force Academy actually later that day, and I said I would really like to still come. And a man at the switchboard, a staff sergeant, said, well, son, why did you not get on the plane this morning? And I said, because I believe I'm called to ministry. And he said, well, you made the right decision. But he could have easily said, get on the next plane, and I probably would have gone.
How interesting that he would say you made the right decision.
I would, yes, I believe that was all of God for sure.
You know, it's interesting. I get this request so often from people that say, I desire so much to hear the audible voice of God. And I say to them, I know that you have already heard the audible voice of God. However, the voice of God sometimes sounds like your wife. The voice of God sometimes sounds like your pastor. The voice of God sometimes sounds like the switchboard operator at the Air Force Academy. The voice of God sometimes sounds like your mentor or someone influential in your life. And so people are missing out, I believe, on this deep understanding of claiming Romans 8:28, but not grasping it in its fullness, that if all things work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose, we would discern, we would look at these messages and influences we're receiving as if they were the audible voice of God. Why do we limit it?
Sure. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, go back to John. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The point is, God's always speaking. His very nature is revelation.
Exactly. Now, you said that in your pastoral career, your preaching career, the Gospel of John was one of the Gospels that you didn't really spend a great deal of time preaching about, because there was something in it that was dynamically and dramatically different than the other Gospels as they were written, and how we related to the examples and stories found within Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Right.
What was it?
Well, I think, one thing perhaps that ruined me on John for at least a few years was my very first book I preached was 1 John. And in 1 John, John tends to go in circles, and I'm more of a logic, progression, probably more Pauline in my approach. And by the time I finished 1 John in my preaching, I swore I would not work with something with John for a long time. I think that was part of it. But I always, like I say, I found John to just be more vague and mysterious than the other Gospels. So it took me a while to get there.
You know, it's interesting that you make a reference to more Pauline in your thinking. What's quite fascinating about that is it's a confession that you have more of a Hebrew mind than a Greek mind. For Paul himself, the Jew, the Benjamite, the Pharisee, would have looked at things differently than the Greek, which is very linear, very boxed, very type, genus, species, everything in its very, very neat order. But the Hebrew mind operates differently. Thus, the text of the Old Testament, including, and in my mind, you'll find me referring to the Gospels as books of the Old Testament, because until Jesus died and declared it's finished, that in my mind would be the last line, the last three words of the Old Testament. Then we have the beginning of the New Testament. And the beginning of the New Testament is when the law has been fulfilled, it's now finished, and then in my mind, as a Jewish man and Hebrew thinking, in my mind, the New Testament then begins after those three words are spoken. So when I look at the context of the Gospels and I put them in first century Judaism, and I look at the presentation of the gospel message, I look at the foundational statement that Jesus made, which is, one, I only say what I heard my Father say. Two, I only do what I saw my Father do. Three,
Yes.
I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These foundational principles say that the entirety of the Tanakh, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets are the reference points for all of the dialogue that Jesus would participate in.
Mm-hmm.
And all the foundational points would be directly quoted, since we've already been told what God said.
Mm-hmm.
We've already been shown what God did. And so I can see why, coming from a Jewish perspective, why the Gospel of John, which is the Genesis Gospel, it is the one that parallels Genesis 1 in its presentation, going back and saying, I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to look at creation, and I'm going to look at when did this all begin. It then further defines Jesus as deity, not as divine, meaning God created, as the angels were, but that he was deity. And that's clearly established in John 1:1, that Jesus is the Son of God. He is God in the flesh. That is an outstanding revelation, but is so different in its presentation than the other three Gospels that unless you insert John into the contemporary first century Second Temple life, it's hard to traverse through it, because it takes you on the journey of the first century Jewish life of Jesus, and why he talked to who he talked to, about what he talked to them about, why he approached who he approached in the way he approached them, and why the things that he said and did were stunning, outstanding, and in your face in regards to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, as we would understand the operation of the Second Temple. One of the reasons that I had this great desire to meet you and to have this dialogue with you is because you grasp in your in-depth study this concept that John was bringing us a key that was going to unlock for us in a way to see heaven, a way to approach heaven, a way to join together with the Messiah, and to hear the clarion call that God is not asking us to do more for him. He is asking us to do more with him. And that becomes evident in this concept of this life of Jesus revealed through the Gospel of John, which is a first-hand account. It is a first-hand report, a first-hand testimony. Just a fascinating approach. We're talking with Dr. John E. Johnson, author of the new book, Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. I want to tell our audience this concept of an open heaven has taken on so many different nuances, so many different man-made, added to extra biblical context, that in its presentation of an open heaven, we have many who have gone outside of the text to embrace an idea that would seem to be greater than, bigger than, more magnificent, but there is nothing more magnificent, there is nothing more revelatory than the open heaven that God has designed for us. And John, I want to just commend you for taking a deep dive into the text, into the word that God gave us, which is so incredibly important. We've been deceived by the extra biblical. I grew up in rabbinic Judaism, deceived by the extra biblical. And at 44 years old, came to faith in Jesus and said, I will no longer accept any of the teachings of man. I will devote the rest of my life to one book, to one author, and to pursue an understanding of what God says is an open heaven, what God says is a relationship, what God says, as opposed to this rabbi or this author. And in this book, you have captured and been faithful to capture what God has to say through John in regards to who Jesus is and how God wants us to live out this life under this open heaven. We've been talking with John Johnson, author of Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. When we come back after this break, we're going to dig into this book that takes us on a journey into the Gospel of John, unlike any other you've taken before. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we are visiting with Dr. John E. Johnson, author of a book entitled Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. Dr. Johnson, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
You, in our opening discussion, said that the Gospel of John was almost a stumbling block to you. It was something that was a challenge that eventually God led you to come face to face with that which was puzzling, challenging, difficult. And what's interesting about the promise that Jesus made was that he said, "You who are tired and heavy laden, take my yoke." In the colloquial context, idiomatic Hebrew, yoke means teaching. He says, "For my teaching is light and easy." And then we come to the book of John, and for you, it's neither light nor is it easy. But now you've done this deep dive into the book of John. And would you agree with me now that you've embraced it, now that you've completely immersed yourself in it, that it is light and it is easy and it's everything that Jesus said it would be when we understand it?
Sure. Yeah, John is a little bit like a wading pool, at least initially for me. It's John 3:16. It's where we often would tell people, when you start on your journey of faith, read the Gospel of John. When I went to seminary studying Greek, we start with John. It's got the simplest Greek. But suddenly you discover when you really do get into the book, it's like a deep, deep ocean rather than a wading pool. And not that you get to the bottom of it. I will never get to the bottom of John. But I discovered this wonderful irony of John, that it is both simple and profound, maybe like all of Scripture. And I think that's what captivated me. And then when I began to see it as a series of conversations, keying off the very first one with Nathaniel, the book suddenly became alive.
You open with this conversation with Nathaniel from John, and he says, "You will see greater things than this." Then Jesus said, "I assure you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." there's a statement in there which is lost on many, that Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man.
Mm-hmm.
The angels that fell from heaven were referred to as B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. By Jesus saying that he was the Son of Man was an absolute declaration that he was not divine, he was not an angel, that he was God in the flesh. And it's all summed up in that statement, the Son of Man. And it's an important one because we have so many who say that he was divine. But divinity is created of God, and Jesus was a part of God. And that's revealed in that statement along with seeing the heavens open. What is this open heaven that he's talking about?
Well, first of all, I think in John 1:51, certainly there's an allusion back to Genesis 28 and Jacob's vision and the ladder.
Yes.
And I believe Jesus brings it all in much clearer form in John 1:51 to say, in a sense, the heavens have now opened. And I find it interesting he uses a tense that implies it's open and it will remain open. And I believe that the rest of the conversations in the book of John then unpack what that actually means. So I take it that the angels ascending and descending are declaring, now the heavens are open, there is divine activity. I think it's a fulfillment of Isaiah 64:1, that where the prophet longs for the day, the heavens will open. And I think maybe in the conversation with the disciples in John 14, when he says, if you believe, you will do not only the same, but greater things. I think he's bringing that all together to say, under an open heaven, you will live a profound life if you will but believe.
Well, when you think about the context of society and the numbers of people alive 2,000 years ago versus the population today, were exponentially greater. The world, according to the Bible, was 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. There are no references to North and South America, no references to Australia. The world defined was 3 continents, not 7. And the populations were under the Roman rule at the time of Jesus. We were still looking at empires, and we were looking at the world defined in terms which were limited. The diaspora, where the Jews were dispersed to, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And now this doing greater things, if 2 million came to faith in Jesus during his lifetime, we're looking at now a population of 2.4 billion believers in Jesus. I would say that that is greater, that is even more than what contextually. So we see that there is great power, and through technology and through the way we've evolved from a communications and the globalization and the preaching of the word, more conversations are taking place with more people groups like Jesus went to. When you looked at the conversations that Jesus had in the book of John, what were some of the surprises for you as to who he spoke to?
Well, almost everyone is a surprise, frankly. It's interesting that he begins to reveal himself, first of all, in a Jewish wedding in John chapter 2. I find it interesting that Nicodemus comes clearly, I think, to take on Jesus, and to only a Jewish teacher does he say you must be born again, which I think is part of the irony of John, that Jesus in John 5 would go to a paralytic who seems to have no interest in Jesus, expresses no faith, and yet Jesus reaches out to him. I find myself mystified as to why him as opposed to someone else. It's just the nature of John. He, at every turn, Jesus is doing things you just don't expect. And I think this was really what was so great for me is I learned a whole different Jesus in the book of John. At least I should maybe say that in a different way. I came to know Jesus in a far different way than I knew Jesus before.
The instances you refer to, the paralytic, Rabbi Nicodemus, and the concept of being born again, there are, in the Jewish context of life at that time, there were expectations of what a Messiah, maybe not the Messiah, but what a Messiah would be able to do. The conversation with Nicodemus, this concept of born again, is actually been almost hijacked by Christianity, but it's very much a very Torah-specific event, and that is water immersion in a mikvah, a cleansing pool, and when the water breaks again, what's been taken into the water because the water is moving disappears. It's washed away, and you become born again, as if you were breaking through your mother's water. Jesus himself broke through the water. Yes. And it's interesting that in the natural we call that, when the head makes its appearance, we call it a crowning. And so we see the same kind of thing replicated. Now he's talking to a rabbi, a Pharisee, who comes to him at night, right, under the cover of darkness, so that he's not seen consorting with him, and he tells him that what's born of the flesh is flesh. So clearly he's establishing the fact that you're not holy. The angels were born into holiness. You're flesh. You were born into flesh. Okay? In order for you to have a new life, you have to be born again of the Spirit, not of the flesh. And no, you cannot go back into your mother's womb, but yet you can be this baptism, tevilah, this immersion in the Spirit that's now become available to you. And in context, it makes an incredible amount of sense understanding the Jewish thought and the Jewish concept of this born again, or this new creation, this cleansing. Mm-hmm. The healing of the paralytic also goes to the message that John the Baptist in prison sends a message to Jesus and says, "Are you the one, or will one come after you?" And an answer is given. And the answer is phrased and framed, "Go tell John what you've seen and what you've heard, and tell him this." And it goes through a list of specifics that are framed specifically related to those things only God can perform. Man cannot perform any of those acts that were detailed.
Right.
And in the book of John, we see in all of these actions the establishment of Jesus is God in the flesh, doing the creative work of God, the resurrecting work of God, the forgiving work of God, the renewing work of God, the healing of blindness, the work of God. Those things that only God himself, man cannot create, we can only recreate. We can procreate, but man does not have the ability to take from nothing and make something. Right? And this is what Jesus did. And it's extraordinary in the book of John. How did this book impact you in your conversations both with the Lord and with congregants?
Well, I have learned to approach a lot of my daily life by being reminded I am under an open heaven.
Yes.
So maybe the confinements, the limitations, the things I once felt I was under have been removed. There is a way of life. There is an expectation of God I should live out each day. I think Jesus, as you said earlier, Jesus so much in the book of John does everything to bring honor and glory to the Father. He says that over and over. I think John therefore helped me to be much more Trinitarian in my approach to God. I think sometimes we can be so Jesus-centric that we miss the Father and we miss the Spirit. And I think John helps bring those things together. So I think in my own personal approach to God, in my understanding of Jesus, who isn't always there to fulfill my every need, because all through the book of John, Jesus is not doing what everyone wants him to do. He's calling them to something far higher. It's got me a lot more out of myself. Maybe I could put it that way.
Do you find that of the four Gospels, that the Gospel of John is the one that gives us the most hope?
The most hope?
Yes.
I don't know. I'd have to really think that through, but certainly that's a big part of the message.
When we look at contemporary life, what is there in the book of John that we can apply to today when you look at this new way of life revealed in John's gospel for you and I, for the everyday person out there? What does that new way of life look like?
I think John 6 is a good illustration where Jesus is speaking to a crowd that very much like our world today, very consumer driven, very much driven by their appetites, their bellies. And Jesus calls them to go way beyond that and calls them to himself. So I think John 6, as one example, speaks to our contemporary age. You can almost every chapter, John 4, the woman at the well, I think speaks to anyone who thinks that maybe they're too far removed from ever experiencing the grace of God. I go back to John 7 with the brothers who are seemingly defined in the moment they live. And Jesus, in the language Jesus uses with his brothers, says, live a life that really matters. And when you do, life will be dangerous. So almost every chapter I find a direct link to today. But then while there's a lot of debate about this, I do believe John was a pastor at heart. He could very well have written this to his congregation in Ephesus. And it could be that in each of these conversations, he has a parishioner in the pew, so to speak, in mind. Because I believe all of these conversations, and after pastoring 32 years, I've seen all of these people in my church.
It's interesting that I've always equated the pastoral calling with being a doctor, and that every pastor is to write a prescription for his flock, for his congregation, based on what's ailing them, what they're contending with. Mm-hmm. So in a city that has 2,500 churches, there could be 2,500 different prescriptions being written
Right.
on any given Sunday based on the collective
Yeah.
needs.
Yes.
You know, your reference, of course, to the book of John establishes something that God answered Moses when Moses was being dispatched to Pharaoh for the first time, and he asked God, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God declares, "I am that I am." We see in the statements of Jesus the I ams. And those I ams are contained within this book of John.
Yes.
Clearly, the audible ear of the listener would have made the connection, because we're still talking about the Old Testament world. We're
Right.
contemporary writing, it's the New Testament, but it is still the Old Testament. Therefore, for Jesus to say, "I am," and make the statements that follow that, "I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd." We can go back into the Old Testament, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I am the good shepherd. I shall not want. Okay. I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of this bread will never go hungry. And we go on, and it's clearly an establishing of I am. I am the one that was there. I am the one that brought you your deliverance. His audience was not
Yes.
the Gentiles. His audience were the Jews. And
Right.
the gathering of the people were of Jewish belief and of Jewish observance. And so these statements are declarations that are in a category of absolutes. The declaration, "I am," is an irrefutable claim. And he's,
Right. Well, and the very declaration, "I am," is given to the woman at the well, which I find, again, a fascinating statement of grace. You have these allusions all the way through John to the Old Testament. And then it seems John uses the Hellenistic world that he's writing to, and uses it would seem the style of Greek theater, where every conversation is a stage with two characters. Everyone else is background, and there's a protagonist and an antagonist. It seems like John was well acquainted, obviously not only with the Old Testament,
right,
but with Greek theater, so that the book weaves the ancient and the present together. I think that's what makes it such a compelling book.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's an outstanding work, and we are delighted to have had you as a guest on our program. We've been talking with John E. Johnson, author of Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. The back of the book says, if you're tired of living a confined life, frustrated by failure, or starving in the midst of plenty, these conversations in John assure you life doesn't have to stay small. There's a whole new world made possible under God's open heaven. God has opened that heaven through this message so that you may have access to every good gift. That the Word of God says that every good gift comes from God. There's now an open heaven, and we get to see the angels descend to bring us messages from God. We get to see our Messiah. We're sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us and giving us access through His shed blood and through the atonement for our sins, that's so eloquently revealed in a simple but complex way in the book of John. It demystifies the book of John for you. I strongly encourage our audience. Visit ignitingnation.com and click on Books and Media and order a copy for yourself, Under an Open Heaven, A New Way of Life Revealed in John's Gospel. Dr. John E. Johnson, thank you so much for being with us here today on Revealing the Truth.
It was a privilege to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and shalom. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we will bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth. We'll be right back.